All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live stream. And today I have a very special guest. His name is Crystal Sturmark. Crystal, do you mind saying hi to the audience?
Hi, good to meet you. I'm so happy that my book came out in China, and it's a wonderful cover.
Yes,
It's
I have this.
beautiful.
The reason we
Yeah.
have the talk today is that because Crystal's book called To Light the Flame of Reason, 中文是点燃理性的火焰, is available in China now. And then we have the privilege of having this conversation with the author who put out this great work about what he wanted to tell the world through this book. And before we dive in, I'll just take a minute to introduce who Crystal is. So Crystal is actually living in Sweden now, and then it's very early for him now. So he's both a author and also a public intellectual. He's a founder and publisher of Free Tanky. I don't know if I pronounce it Free Tanky.
That's right.
Okay.
It means free thinker.
Yeah, it means free thinker, and it's a publishing house in Sweden. And also, if you can understand Swedish, unfortunately I cannot. You probably hear him quite often because he often appears on TV, also public gatherings. And when he appears in those public forum, what he does is he defends science and argue against dogmas, superstition, and pseudoscientific thinking. So then I think we're all familiar with this concept, even in the Chinese language environment. So he basically has been had made this his career and also has been putting multiple good work into the public domain. And before we get to the content, I also want to say it's actually a bit of a legendary story for this book to be available in Chinese to everyone, because the original book was written in Swedish. And it was first translated by a thinker and author that many Chinese are familiar with, Douglas Hofstadter. 中文叫侯世达. He even has a Chinese name.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and then so Hofstadter has been not only translating this work, but basically be working with Crystal to, I would say, recreate this work in the English language. And then so the original book was published, is it 2016 or 17?
Something like that, yeah.
Like that, yeah. And then the English one then came out in 2021. And then there's another remarkable translator, Mei Jianhua. So he's the chair of the Department of Philosophy from Capital Normal University. And he's the translator to the Chinese version. So basically, multiple great thinkers and authors along the way to make this book available in Chinese. You can find it in the link below. So I would just feel remarkable that we can have access to this great body of work through multiple intellectuals and publishing houses along the way. So I'm reading with gratitude when I go version.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So with that, I want to start probably with the first question, because frankly, Crystal, when I first opened the book, it feels very heavy. It feels very dark, because you started with concerns of the modern age we're living in. Yeah. So can you start from there? Like why you decide to put this book out in a time of current day?
Yeah, well, basically, I feel very strongly that the clear thinking is on the decline. I mean, people are attracted to so many versions of pseudoscience or superstitions, new age ideas. Also now these days, conspiracy theories that is all over the internet. And I feel it's a little bit the same thing as what happened about 100 years ago, when, like the intellectual capital of Europe at that time was Vienna. Fantastic philosophers, music, literature, art created in science. And then the First World War, of course, and then the Second World War threw Europe into a very dark time. And I'm feeling that there is something like that going on now in the world, where people are leaving the clear thinking, leaving the rational, reasonable way of thinking about things and get attracted to all these weird ideas that has no evidence or is based just on rumors on the internet and so on. So I wanted to write a book that sort of reestablish the Enlightenment values again that once were thought of by philosophers, you know, and I want to sort of reintroduce the Enlightenment values for the 21st century, basically.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's indeed true. I think most Chinese authors also knows about Stefan Zweig's work. I think he took his life 1942.
Something like that, yeah.
Right, around that time. And then exactly based on what you're saying, and then he basically felt that the world is collapsing. All the pale horses he talked about are
exactly
galloping into the world.
Yeah.
And he's so depressed that he decided to leave the world. I think the world today, indeed, as you said, I have to say that strongly resonate with me, because I went to the States myself in 2000 to pursue a PhD in molecular biology. So during the years I was in the States, I feel this, very strong split, or, the polar almost forces. Because on the one hand, yes, you have the greatest, the scientists and scientific institutions.
Yeah.
In the US, I'm sure for Europe is the same. But on the other hand, you have this almost this unimaginable level of stupidity.
Yes.
Of conspiracy theory, like anti-vaccine movement, and one after another with like it's baseless, and but there's so many people believing in it, and then seeing, and also I think what's striking is that the numbers seem to be on the rise.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think since 2016, the presidential term until now, like today, recently we're watching another presidential debate again, and you see. Yeah, so much public resources are being put out to explain the most basic facts. Sometimes
and also, I mean, like in the presidential debate the other day now, where the former president Donald Trump says things like immigrants are eating the dogs and cats and pets, and and it's so hilarious. I mean, it's so hilarious. And I 20 years ago, I would never have imagined that a presidential candidate could say something stupid like that. But now it's happening all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then I think actually this, because I did have a privilege of reading this book, but I know most readers haven't. Crystal actually got into that topic in his book, but since I have the opportunity, I'll ask him why we are so split. As you said, on the one hand, like human intelligence, technology has been unprecedented in terms of development, right? But on the other hand, like it seems like we as a race are so hopeless. Why all this theory came out, and why it's so popular?
Yeah, but first of all, I think that there is a problem with social media and the internet, because the algorithms and the news feeds and everything, they sort of custom tailor the information to each individual based on their preferences and what they are looking at and so on, which means that you create sort of a bubble for people who believes in a certain conspiracy theory or whatever. So people, they think that they are researching freely on the internet, but they are not, because they are fed information that is aligned with their preferences, with their values and so on. And and of course, if you don't get exposed to opposing information to your ideas, then you will never realize that you have been fooled, basically. So that is one of the problems, I think. Then also, as you know, in the book, I'm very critical to religious fundamentalism and so on. But I also think that some of these new age ideas, or superstition ideas, also is replacing traditional religion to people who I mean, if you go 100 years back, in Europe at least, many people were involved with the church just out of tradition, and you just had to believe certain things. Now people are much more free to believe whatever they want, which unfortunately leads completely down the drain in many cases.
Yeah, I think your book has this very interesting perspective to me. You're talking about like why we ended up in that situation, like why there seem to be a community or increasing community of people who believe in superstition, conspiracy theory. You actually tapped into the way evolution worked for us, right? So it's the survival of the fittest. But to survive, you don't have to be logical at times, right? Is that why? Is that our kind of, are we genetically positioned?
It's a very good point you're making here, because evolution didn't develop our cognitive skills to find the truth always. It developed our cognitive skills to survive, actually. And of course, in many cases, it is good to believe the right thing, the true thing, to survive. I mean, if there's a tiger attacking me, it's better that I think it's a tiger than a bush, for example. But it is not always the case that finding what's true is the best for survival. Sometimes it's better to be integrated with a group, for example, to believe the same thing as the group thinks, even if it's false. I mean, evolution thinks that that might be the best thing to do. Obviously, for us, because we have a capacity to reflect intellectually on a meta level, so to speak. Obviously for us, we can realize that evolution has not helped us to find the truth in every case. And that's where we need other methods to find the truth, like the scientific method, for example, double-blind tests, for example, and so on. That's why science has developed these methods, because we know that our intuitions is not always the best way to understand the world. Just a very simple example. Intuitively, it is quite obvious that the Earth is flat, because that's the intuition for me when I'm looking around. But it's not true. And I need scientific methods to realize that the Earth is not flat.
Yeah. No, indeed. So that's so this is all in this book. So the book has two parts. Well, I'll get Crystal to talk a little bit more about it. And then so the part one is the art of thinking clearly. So what Crystal talked about just now is actually in that book. So we first understand why we cannot think clearly. Like there are limitations that our evolution has worked in a way to block us from thinking clearly at times, but doesn't mean there's no tools. And on the contrary, there are many tools that human ingenuity has created that can help us break this barrier. And then the second part of the book is called The Pathway to a New Enlightenment. So basically, I think the way I see it is the first part is what we can do as an individual, as a person, right? Like, tools I can use, biases I can be aware of, and sort of sometimes mental tricks that, we can use to help ourselves. And then the second part is more around how do we look at, the things we could do as a group? How do we take a bigger perspective? Lessons from history and things we can take at a collective level to tackle this challenge. So I'll start with a few very interesting points you made in the first part. You made this very interesting distinction between knowledge and wisdom. Can you explain to us what's knowledge, what's wisdom?
Well, I would say, knowledge and rational thinking is in a way, it's a mechanical process. I mean, to draw conclusions from certain given facts, if you do it in a rational way, you can know that the premises, if they are true, then the conclusion is also true. If you follow certain sort of processes of deriving a conclusion from premises, that's rationality. But and to have the premises you need knowledge, of course, but that is not enough, because a rational decision doesn't have to be morally good, for example. So wisdom is the rational process plus values, certain values. I mean, of course, you can't, even if you have good values, but you have an irrational process, then you won't get a good result. But you can't have only rational processes. You need the value system as well. So that's what you could call wisdom, I think.
Yeah, and then based on that back, you actually, started talking about secular humanism. Can you explain what you mean by secular humanism?
Yeah, secular humanism is a worldview and a value system, a life stance, if you wish. Just like some of the religious traditions, like Christianity or Hinduism or whatever, Buddhism, it's a worldview and a life stance, but it differs from the religious ones in certain ways. For example, in the secular humanist worldview, you have a view of the world as a natural world. There is no supernatural forces. There is no gods that interfere with the world. So in philosophy, you call that a naturalistic worldview. Therefore, secular humanist is also an atheist. I mean, we think that there are no gods existing. But it's important to understand that all secular humanists are also atheists, but all atheists doesn't have to be secular humanists. Because an atheist could basically believe in ghosts or believe in astrology or whatever. I mean, the only thing you know about an atheist is that he or she doesn't believe in God. But a secular humanist has this scientific method, the rational thinking as a ground to test every proposal about reality. And then you have to just realize that astrology doesn't work because it's been tested a lot, and there's been done a lot of experiments on what astrologers say about people, and it basically doesn't work. Or a secular humanist would not believe that a Buddhist monk can levitate in the air, for example, because it's quite easy to test it. And I mean, if there would come a test where you could show that this happens, of course, then we have to change our minds. But as long as that hasn't happened, it goes against the laws of gravity, and therefore we do not believe that. So secular humanism is more than just a naturalistic worldview. It's also this concept of rational thought, scientific method, and wisdom, with the value system saying that human dignity is important, human values are universal. It's not the case that in one culture it is okay to treat women very badly, and in another culture it's not okay. A secular humanist would say, no, these human rights are universal and they should be equal for everyone. So yeah, that's some of the content of secular humanism.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you're captivated by the way Crystal talk about this process, I certainly was. It's actually in the book, and then I think the Chinese version is very well done as well in explaining what that is. And I think one of the things you talked about is also you clarified very interesting concepts. So just now you talked about the rationality, or being rational versus having freedom, is like one is the mechanical process of getting it right, and which again is the right thing to do. But to get to to get to wisdom is that plus the value, plus seeing human needs with a equal eye, despite culture or despite whatever the community constraints we put on. The other thing you did talk about, it was also the criteria of knowledge. I think you actually dated back to Plato. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What are the 3 criteria of something qualifying as knowledge?
Actually, yeah, true. I mean, Plato defines knowledge with 3 criteria. You have knowledge if you believe something, and if it is true what you believe, and if you have good reasons to believe what you believe. if all these three criteria is fulfilled, then you have knowledge. And this is interesting because it actually shows that belief is a part of knowledge. I mean, I cannot have knowledge about that Paris is in the country of France if I don't believe that Paris is a part of France. I need to believe it, but it also needs to be true. Otherwise, it's not knowledge, quite obviously. But it's also required that you have a good reason for what you believe. I mean, if I say that I think it is 12 persons in that house right now, and it happens to be true, but I just guessed, I was just guessing, I just was lucky because I was right, then I don't have knowledge about it either. I have to have a good reason. I have to have looked up that in books that Paris is in France, or I have to check the numbers of people in the house or whatever. So these three criteria is the sort of philosophical definition of what knowledge is. Yeah.
Yeah. And then so that's knowledge, which is sort of almost the entry level access, knowing something, right?
Exactly.
And then you talked about reality and perception. Because sometimes the people were saying, well, like, what's real? Like, I don't know, because we have this sort of this human limits, right? This is, I perceive things through my eyes or through how I feel. So is there a real truth, or this is all around perception?
No, but this is really a very interesting thing you're bringing up, and it is very complicated because we know from science, especially the quantum physics, for example, that we don't really understand the nature of reality. I mean, what's called ontology. I mean, the true nature of reality. We do not know exactly how that works. All we can do is to do experiments. We can test it. We can build theories or conceptual models that predict the outcome of the experiments. That's what we can say about reality. But my very firm belief, which is also a part of the secular humanist worldview, it is that there is an objective reality. I mean, I'm not inventing reality from the ground up in my head. There is something out there that we can try to understand and try to study through our methods. So that is what is called philosophical realism. I mean, there is something there that we can try to investigate. But I mean, I don't think we ever, or at least not for quite long, will have a complete theory of reality. I mean, relativity and gravity and quantum physics doesn't merge, for example. So we will see a development someday with new theories in physics and so on. But still, I believe that there is an objective reality, and we use the scientific methods to move closer to it, so to speak. Then also, I mean, something that you very often hear from people who like New Age stuff is that they are saying, yeah, but there is so much we don't know, and how can you be sure that there is no ghosts and so on? And they're right in the sense that, of course, I cannot be 100% sure. I can just say that it's the most likely thing is that there are no ghosts because there is no evidence for it. I mean, and that's all you can do. You can always, I mean, you can only say that the current knowledge of the world right now indicates that this hypothesis is more likely than this one. And if you have the secular humanist attitude, you should always be open to change your mind. But that doesn't mean that you should believe anything that's been said to you. You have to choose the idea or the hypothesis that is best evidence-based in every situation. Yeah, that's the sort of basic attitude to knowledge, I think, that you should have. Completely open, but always believe what has best evidence.
Thank you. It's very well said. I think then that leads to the next one. It's very often very confusing in the public domain, which is the difference between reality and truth. Is truth subjective? Because people would say, hey, who knows? Where's the truth? Who has the authority to explain truth?
Yeah.
How do we understand this too?
No, you're completely right. There is a big confusion on this, and people also confuse the fact that we cannot be sure about how something is. They confuse that with the idea of subjective truth. They say that, okay, this is true for me, it doesn't have to be true for you, and so on. And this is just a confusion because even if there are things we don't know, for example, is there life on other planets, for example, we really don't know that. It's still the case that either there is life on other planets or there is not life on other planets. It's an objective truth. Maybe we will never find out, or maybe we will, we don't know, but it's still an objective truth. And I think it's very dangerous if you confuse these things, because if you start to think of truth in a relativistic way, saying that, well, it's true for me, it doesn't have to be true for you, then you suddenly find yourself in a moral collapse, because then anything could be true for anyone and it doesn't matter, you know. And also, I mean, then you can never be wrong, because being wrong requires an objective truth. Otherwise, there is nothing to be wrong about. So I think that people who have this relativistic view of truth, they are in a way very narcissistic, because they think that I define what's true. It's very self-centered. But if you accept that there is an objective truth, then you also have to accept that you can be wrong, and you should always be open to change your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Because I think that leads to another domain where I think there's a lot of confusion as well. So especially in the West, when we talk about cultural diversity, like for example, we know, each religion or each culture or tradition has its own norms. And of course, if you're open-minded, if you have a humanism view, you respect their culture. But where is the limit? So I will take example of the recent change in Afghanistan, you probably followed, that they are severely restricting women's rights to extent that the civilized world has never seen before. But you could also say, hey, this is their religion, right? Okay, if they are okay with it, I respect their view, or I respect the way they practice their religion. Who am I to point a finger at them? How do you rebut that one?
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem when we want to be so tolerant, so we accept intolerance, and that's where the limit is. I think you should not tolerate intolerance, and the problem is you can't really say that this is their culture, it's up to them, because the women in this culture doesn't want to have it like that. We know that, for example, in Afghanistan. So they are suppressing their own women, and in that case, I think you need to define the universal human rights, saying that it doesn't matter what religion or culture you have, there are a limit to what you can do and how you can treat your own people. Then obviously that's easy to say in theory, but of course, I mean, what should West do? I mean, should we start a war and attack them? Well, maybe that's not the best way. You have to find some ways to work with these issues, but the principle should be very clear. The human rights must be universal.
Thank you. I love how what you say. Tolerance doesn't mean you tolerate intolerance.
Exactly. I think it was Karl Popper who actually talked about that, the philosopher, European philosopher 100 years ago. I think he sort of discussed that in the book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is a classical book. I want to say something else about what we just previously talked about also, and that is being open-minded, because I in many debates I've been in television and radio and so on, I've often heard that people say, for example, if they are inclined to new age ideas, they say that, for example, we discuss if there is ghosts, just to give a simple example, or if a Buddhist monk can levitate or whatever. They say to me, oh, you don't believe in these things, you should be more open-minded, don't be so closed, and so on. And this goes back to a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of open-minded, because being open-minded is not defined by what you believe. It is defined by how willing you are to change your mind if you have new facts presented to you. So if you have two persons, one believing in ghosts and one believing that there are no ghosts, you have no idea who is the most open-minded person of these two. It could be either of them that is more open-minded than the other. It is only defined by your willingness to rethink your view in view of new information. And if it was true that, like some people might think, that the more impossible things you believe, or the more unlikely things you believe, the more open-minded you are, then you would have to say that people who believes the earth is flat is extremely open-minded, or who believes that, you know, there are green men on the moons, on the backside of the moon, they're extremely open-minded, because it's very impossible, very unlikely that it's true. And obviously everyone would say, no, of course that is not being open-minded. So open-mindedness is not defined of what you believe, it is defined by how willing you are to change your mind. I think that's important.
Exactly. And I like, no, if I may, I say, you said how willing you're, how open you're willing to change your mind based on your evidence.
Exactly.
Because if not based on evidence, then you're just willing to change your mind. That means you don't have a firm mind.
Exactly. Someone wrote somewhere that you should always be open-minded, but not so open-minded so your brains falls out.
Too open. It blows
Too. Exactly. Exactly.
Exactly. Well, thank you for clarifying. This is such an intellectual treat to hear you talk, because I think those are, especially when you mention in debates, and then, you know, even like you're watching the presidential debate or many other college level debates, like I guess one of the common problem is that people throw away big concepts, and especially big concept based on certain value or has value connotation. So like open-minded is definitely one, right? So everybody want to be known as being open-minded, not being narrow-minded, but without knowing what does open-minded mean. So almost like, because you want to be open-minded, morally you have to say yes to all kinds of strange theories. But that's based on a misunderstanding of what open-minded means. It doesn't mean anything goes. It means that, you know, as you said very beautifully, that means that you're willing to change your mind based on new evidence. And
exactly.
Yeah, and you also talked about the, you know, if I may follow up on that, on chapter 3 of the book. Again, everybody can find, you know, the conversation is only, you know, little, because the book is basically, you know, full of gold, and we're only picking a little bit of gold nuggets in this conversation. So make sure to find the book in the link below. 大家可以在下面的购物车里看到这本书哈，书里面有很多很多的很有意思的、非常重要的一些概念的厘清哈，对我们如何思维和如何在辩论中理解到这个事情的真谛非常有用的。I'm just saying something in Chinese. So then, because your chapter 3 of your book, you actually also mentioned the how to distinguish between evidence and proof. I think that's very interesting. So we talk about based on new evidence. Okay, then is that proof?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this goes actually back to the Swedish language, because in Swedish you don't really separate proof and evidence, and I'm trying to explain that it's actually two separate concepts. Proofs, if you should be very formal about this, proof only exists in mathematics, because if you have a mathematical theorem and if you prove it correctly all the way, so to speak, then it can never be changed. I mean, it can never turn out that it was wrong later if the proof is made correctly within the formal system of mathematics. So mathematical proofs are real proofs. Scientific statements are by definition provisional. I mean, what you call it, they are temporal in the sense that you can find out new things about the world that makes it necessary to modify your scientific idea or scientific theory, so to speak. So that obviously doesn't mean that you should be skeptic to everything that science says, because you have some scientific theories that is very, very well evidence-based, like evolution, for example, or whatever, that vaccines work, for example. You have extremely strong evidence for that. But of course, there are other scientific ideas like string theory in cosmology, for example, where there is actually no evidence at all yet. Or you had the Big Bang theory that 50, 60 years ago was not very much evidence for that either. Then slowly but surely science accumulated more and more evidence, which makes it slowly but surely more reasonable to really believe in that theory. So science never proves anything. Science just gives more or less good evidence, so to speak, for different ideas. So that's also, it's important to be to understand that science is a process rather than an established dogma, so to speak. That's the whole beauty of science, that it's not dogmatic, it's a process. Then of course there is always scientists that can be very stubborn, or I mean, scientists are humans like everyone. So, but that's another thing. The scientific process in itself has the critical eye built into the process, and the scientific community has this built in as well, because if there is a new theory coming up from a very avant-gardistic scientist, then a lot of other scientists will try to disprove it, or try to sort of go through it carefully, and that's the beauty of the scientific process.
Yeah, that's very important. I want to, if I may, I want to ask you to elaborate on that, because I think you're saying scientific process, it's a process, it's a process. That means it's not a, I mean, if you compare to the scientific approach versus, let's say, a religion, right? Religion asks you to believe. Or there are certain things there, like oftentimes it's hard to prove or explain, but they don't bear the burden of proving. Almost
exactly.
The burden of proving is on the believer. Like, if you want to be absorbed or included into this community, somehow you have to convince yourself that this is what things are, how things are. But the scientific process is very different. So like you actually mentioned a few. For example, you mentioned basically it's the peer review process, meaning like
exactly.
If I publish something, you say I prove this, I share this in the public domain, either through a publication, scientific paper, or in a conference, and people will try to replicate it. And if people can repeat it, many people can repeat it, that means it's more likely to be true.
Exactly.
Versus the other. So that's one core element. What are the other core elements of the scientific process? How do we know a process is a scientific process versus not?
Well, I think basically you said it, that you need to be able to replicate the experiments, for example, and it has to be not dependent on a certain person, for example. I mean, it has to be interpersonal in that sense. I mean, if you go to traditional religions, you can have someone calling himself a prophet and who had a revelation, and it's only that person who had this revelation, but he or she teaches it as a new teaching, and it requires that people just believe it. Science doesn't work that way. You have an hypothesis, you test it, and it should be able to replicate by other scientists or other persons. That's the very important part. But then also, I mean, I think it's important to understand that the scientific process is in theory, it is perfect. But of course, in practical life, it's not always clean. I mean, you have, like, for example, commercial companies that could produce a scientific report with an agenda. I mean, they want to show something that is good for their business and so on. So in that sense, it can be unclean. But the beauty of the process is that it is slowly but surely you get rid of the unclean stuff, because it will still be necessary to be able to replicate it. And if it was if it was a report with an agenda, then that will show up sooner or later, so to speak. But and then also there are, of course, important that you accept creativity in the scientific process. I mean, a scientist can, in theory, come up with a new idea through a dream. I mean, Einstein was thinking Einstein was thinking of things that was completely untestable at that time. But after that, that dream or that sparkling idea comes up, then it needs to be tested. And then slowly but surely, I mean, Einstein didn't even get the Nobel Prize for the relativity theory. He got the prize for other things he did in physics, because the theory of relativity wasn't well tested at that time. So he couldn't be given, I mean, the Nobel Committee didn't want to give him the Nobel Prize for that. I mean, but later, it's the theory of relativity has been tested extremely well, and we really know today that it affects time, for example, because you can put up a clock in a space station around the Earth, and you can show that the clock goes slow, time goes slower than down on Earth. You can measure that today, and the theory of relativity predicted it. It sounded crazy when he came up with the idea. A lot of scientists thought this must be a mistake. It cannot be that time goes slower. But today we know that's the case because we made experiments on it. So yeah, that's the beauty of science.
Yeah, thank you. Beautifully said. So what Crystal just shared is in chapter 4 of this book. Basically, the name of the chapter is called "What is Science?"
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically it says, I want to read this. I think it's very interesting. You basically said how science actually mirrors the inquisitive nature of children, which I love. You said,
Yeah.
children learn through trial and error, right? So like
Yeah.
that's basically what science is. Like we try something, it didn't work. Okay, that we're not going there anymore. Let's go some other way. And then you basically said science is a systematic extension of this natural curiosity. You know, this is a natural curiosity, kind of innate with children, but then when it becomes a process, especially at the society level, it's a systematic extension. And you are saying that basically by applying structured methods to explore and understand the world, which is basically what you just described. And I think it's beautifully said, because I think, you know, when people approach science, we oftentimes think, oh, this is an excellent body of work. I'm sure for the audience listening to this, maybe 90% people don't really understand what Einstein did, right? Like we're not physicists, we're not genius. So I think science sometimes gave people this impression that, okay, this is only reserved for the smart people.
Yeah.
But basically, I think in chapter 4, you were saying this is, you know, if you see, you know, how inquisitive children are, and then that's basically us. Like, you know, this is the way our intellects develop. And when you
you're so right. I mean, we're all scientists. I mean, every child is a scientist, you know, and the only thing is that the scientific method developed also methods for dealing with our intuitions that go wrong, so to speak. The child is very intuition driven, but he or she is still testing the environment all the time. But the scientific method helps us to not fall for our wrong intuitions, so to speak. So you're so right. And also the scientific method, I mean, two very important concepts, I think, is verification and falsification. I mean, to have a scientific theory, you have to be able to define what kind of experiment you can have to verify this theory, and then you have to be able to say, if my theory is correct, then this would be the result if I do this experiment. You must be able to say that in advance, so to speak, of the experiment. And then you do the experiment, and then two things can happen. Either the results is what you predicted, and then you could say that my theory has been verified. It's been it is more likely to be correct, so to speak. Or the result is completely different from your prediction, and then you actually falsify the theory. Then you know that the theory must be wrong, so you have to go back and then define a new theory, so to speak. So the process, and the interesting thing is, the process is, if you verify your theory, you can't be sure that it's perfectly correct, but if you falsify the theory, then you can actually be sure that it's not correct.
Exactly. And also you said, I think you say, like, scientific theories are approximations of reality.
Exactly.
That improve over time rather than a definitive truth, right?
Exactly.
So
you're so right. And I mean, this is really important to understand, because when you sometimes talk to people who are skeptic to science, they say that you know, science has been wrong so many times. For example, look at Newton's theory of physics, so to speak. Then came Einstein and showed that he was completely wrong. Well, it's not really true that Einstein showed he was completely wrong. Einstein's theory was just a better approximation of how the world is. I mean, Newton's theory is still applicable in every practical way of life when we drive our cars in 100 kilometers per hour. And I mean, in normal speeds and in normal sizes and in normal situations, Newton's theory is just good enough. But when you come up in high speeds that you can never do actually in practice, then Newton's theory doesn't approximate good enough. So then you need the theory of relativity. So, I mean, even if Einstein rethought the concepts of space and time, but it's still, he didn't falsify Newton. He just made a much better description of reality. So that's also a part of the scientific process, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I think oftentimes I often get this question as well, like, you know, can science and religion coexist? Because we know, especially in the West, many scientists by profession are religious as well, like, or at least belong to certain religion or religious community. All right, so then I have another question for you, Crystal, which is, can science and religion coexist? Because we all know that there are many scientists are actually also religious, right? They're Christian or they go to church. How do they, you know, blend together?
That's a very interesting question and topic you're bringing up. Well, first of all, I would say that science and religion can coexist as long as the religion doesn't make any truth claims about the nature of reality. And what I mean by that is that there are people who would define themselves as religious, but who takes all the stories in the Bible, for example, to be metaphorical. I mean, it's a metaphorical description. They don't believe that Jesus really resurrected from the dead, or that he was born from a virgin, or that he was walking on water and so on. They don't believe in that as historical things that really happen, facts. Yeah, exactly. They believe it as a metaphorical or mythological description that still can convey some truths in the moral sense, like stories, but not as historical facts. And if you have that kind of attitude to religion, then of course it can coexist with the scientific worldview. But as soon as you try to claim that Christianity or Islam or whatever has truths about the nature of reality, objective reality, then it cannot coexist. And the best example probably is the conflict between evolution and creationism. That is a quite big thing in Muslim countries and also in evangelical Christianity. Not the Catholic Church, because they accept evolution, but that Protestant evangelical Christianity doesn't do that very much around the world. And in America, I think about 40% of the population doesn't accept evolution. And they believe that God created the humans not as ancestors from apes, but you know, created in God's image and so on. And a very common argument for that is, of course, that the body and the human or the species, even animals, are so complex systems, so they couldn't come through just blind random processes. But I mean, like evolution, that's what they would say, but they have misunderstood what evolution says, because evolution is not at all random. Evolution is based on the idea of natural selection. It's a selection based on what individuals are best fitted to the environment. So it's definitely not random at all. Of course, the randomness comes into the small mutations in the DNA that happens, the variations, but the actual process of natural selection is not random. It is driven by the survival of the fittest, which is not a random process. So this is a very common mistake, but yeah, a lot of people, like I said, in America believes in creationism instead, and that is not compatible with science at all, obviously.
Yeah, and then that leads to another question. As you said, 40% Americans don't believe. Let's say, what if that number is 80%? And people would say, hey, if something 80% people don't believe it, that must be false. Can we deduct that?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is that as long as you believe in an objective truth, it doesn't matter how many people think something. Even, I mean, it doesn't affect whether it's false or not. That's the simple answer. The truth in something depends on if it is correct, basically, if reality is that way or not. It's completely independent of what people believe.
So I think that's why there's such a big market for pseudoscience. Can you tell us how do we differentiate between science and pseudoscience?
Well, okay, this is a complicated thing. First of all, it has real science should be testable with the scientific method. Pseudoscience is often ideas that is dressed up in scientific words, but it's like just like a, what you call it in English, like a mask, just dressing up using scientific words, but there is no real scientific content. I mean, the classic example is how the new age industry is using quantum physics. They say, the quantum physics is so mystical, so it shows that we have a collective consciousness, or that maybe ghosts live in the extra dimensions of quantum physics and so on. And they are right that quantum physics is very, very hard to understand on an intuitive way, but it's not an argument for new age ideas about ghosts or consciousness or whatever. It is just, they just abuse the scientific language and apply it on other things. And in a way, you can say they almost think like this. They say quantum physics is mystical, new age things is mystical, there must be a connection. And I mean, that's obviously just a crazy idea.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is what we just discussed is in chapter 4 of this book, basically talking about science. There are many gems in that chapter. So there are a few concepts we just mentioned in the conversation. Again, you can find a lot of the extended discussion and how do we understand different concepts in the book. And I'm going to throw you another curveball question about science, because I think especially for people in sort of from ancient civilizations that, like one in China. And one thing I often hear is that, okay, think about our culture. We've been here for like 3,000 years. And then, the science or age of enlightenment happened, let's say, 300-400 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Modern science developed. We have a civilization before this thing exists. All right. So then, there's basically religion, myths, the world is enchanted, there's witchcraft and all that. Hey, but it didn't stop the civilization from developing. And then didn't stop it from becoming a very interesting and very powerful civilization. So is science really that important?
No, but it's a very good question, and especially your country of China had a fantastic civilization long before we in Sweden had that. We were living in the Stone Age while you had this beautiful civilization. But so that's obviously true. You can have a great civilization without science, but you cannot develop vaccines without science, and you cannot develop vaccines without understanding the process of viruses or how the body actually works. I mean, you cannot develop any kind of medicine without understanding how the body works. You cannot develop airplanes without understanding gravity and the air and so on. So in that sense, yeah, we could live in a world without science, but a lot of people would die before they grow up in different illnesses, and yeah, in that way, I think so science has contributed enormously to the well-being of human beings in modern times. I think that's quite obvious. Then also you mentioned those great civilizations had a lot of myths and so on. Yeah, that is true. Partly myths that carry moral truths in a way that you can learn from, even if it is myths. But also, I mean, I personally think that the concept of a God that interferes with our world actually comes from our cognitive processes where we try to find patterns in nature before science. I mean, I think I have the example in my book that if you lived on the savannah and there is a flash from the sky coming down, burning down your little house there, and you have no scientific idea at all about what this is, then obviously you think there is a power up there that destroyed my house. And obviously you think that I don't want that to happen. I want to please this power. So I sacrifice a goat or some fruits or whatever, because I'm normally becoming happy when I get food. So probably this guy also will be happy if I sacrifice a goat. I mean, obviously it's quite easy to understand how the concept of such a God is created in our minds, because we are built cognitively to find patterns and to find intentionality, you know, and we agency and intentionality, and we know that our brains is how to say that, over representing intentionality and agency, and which has helped us to survive. Because I think I write it in my book, it's better to mistake a bush for a tiger than to mistake a tiger for a bush. I mean, if I walk out in the dark and I see a movement at the side of my eye, I don't know what it is. It's better to think that it is dangerous and get away from there, even if I'm wrong, so to speak. That's better than the opposite, because then I would be eaten if I think the tiger is a bush. So in that sense, we have a tendency to think of agency and intentionality even from objects that is no agents or has no intentions, like the flash from the sky. So it's easy to understand why we invented gods in that way.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to go back to the point you mentioned about, ancient civilizations versus science. I think you mentioned that already, but it's very interesting. For example, people probably in China also know, up until probably, over 100 years ago, the average life expectancy of Chinese people are probably in a range of 40 years. And now is in the range of 70 to 80. So during the great age of ancient civilization, people die very early. There are a lot of diseases we suffer from. And also the other, so that's why, sorry, I think that's one angle, is basically if you look at advance, is you look at data like that to show how commoners benefited from science. I think the other thing about this ancient civilization, just like the Egyptians or Mesopotamian or all this ancient civilization or China too, is that what's left is usually sort of the ruling classes world. You're left with the Great Wall, right? Of course, that's a massive masterpiece. But if you and I were born in that time in China, the chances we are a labor dying on the project is much higher than the chance we are the emperor.
Exactly. Yeah. True.
So like now we can now say, hey, because that age built the Great Wall, therefore that's a much greater age than the age that didn't build a Great Wall, right? So because it was built, it's just one aspect, because there are many reasons left. First of all, it's made of rocks or stones. Of course, they last over time. Second, it's a massive structure and all that. So but oftentimes we take one phenomenon, one fact, and generalize it for what it represents in the time. That doesn't mean if it's a dynasty that built a Great Wall, that means it's a strong dynasty. You cannot directly draw that conclusion. Even if you can, you have to think about what is the strength for. It is for the emperor, but what if you're just a labor? What if you're just a slave? What if you're just a a militant that get recruited against your will? I think that aspect is often missing when we look at history.
Very, very true. And these ideas of universal human rights came actually quite late in the the development of civilizations. And it was a product of the Enlightenment ideas 300-400 years ago. But obviously there has been ideas like that is much older, but still it was taking a manifest structure just 300-400 years ago.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm so sad we don't have too much time. I want to also cover the second part of the book.
Sure.
Before we get on, I want to we linger a little bit longer on the first part, because I think there's a golden chapter here. It's called "Ghost in the Head," which is chapter 5. And you talk about I think I like the chapter name too. It's concerning our wonderful but easily fooled brains.
Yeah.
Talking about all kind of like illusions or patterns or things that basically different kind of traps that we ended up falling into.
Yeah.
It's an excellent chapter. Yeah, but is there, if you want to pick one thing, Krista, from that chapter, you want to share with us? Because it's hard for me to pick because everything seems so interesting.
Oh dear, I don't even remember exactly which examples I have. Well, I think I have this example of.
I have choice blindness, focus on blind spots.
No, but let me take this one. I mean, it's a quite simple one. I think it's called framing in English. That if I ask a person, how old do you think Mahatma Gandhi was when he died? I start like this. Do you think that Mahatma Gandhi was 120 years old when he died? Most people would say, no, I don't think so. Okay, how old do you think he was then, I say? And then people will come up with a guess. And if I do this with 100 persons, I will get different guesses and I can take the average. And I would say these 100 persons presented with a question in that way, they had an average guess of these years. And if I take another 100 person and I don't ask them, do you think Mahatma Gandhi was 120 years old when he died? I just asked them, how old do you think he was when he died? And I take the average of that. That will be a lower number in the second group than the first group. And this is called anchoring effect or framing. Anchoring effect probably is the correct English word. That I mentioned 120 first, and that sort of stays in your mind when you put out your guess, which makes your guess will be a little bit higher than it would have been if I hadn't mentioned the figure 120. And that's a very simple example on how easily we can fool our brain, actually. There's another example. I don't know if it's in the book, actually, but I think it's quite funny. If you make this experiment with a person that you put up on a big computer screen 200 small portraits of people randomly on the screen, and one of them is of yourself. And then you can measure how long it takes to find your own portrait about these 200. And you do it many times, you sort of randomly redistribute them, and then you have to find yourself again. And you can measure the average time it takes your eyes to find yourself. Okay, if you do that, you get an average. And then if you do it again, and you Photoshop your own portrait so that you look better than you really do, then you find yourself faster. People find themselves faster if it is Photoshopped to be a little bit better, which is quite interesting as well. So
I think that's in the book called bloated self-image.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Bloated. We all tend to believe we are nicer than we actually look.
Yes, exactly. It's very funny.
But I want to add, I think that's used a lot in politics.
Oh, yes.
Right? Yeah. So if you look at portraits, I mean, probably not anymore, but if you look at portraits of emperors, I mean, the past, there are many of them. Like, of course we would, people probably don't think from a brain science point of view, saying, well, of course they are glorious. But actually there is a, material political benefit from painting people that way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's
No,
actually
but it's used a lot, and I mean this anchoring effect. The first thing I mentioned, it's used a lot when it comes to pricing on products in shops, for example. I mean, if you have a realization where you lower the prices, and if you say that the original price, you can say that that was much higher than it actually was, because then it seems like I'm making a really good deal if I buy this now, and so on. It's very manipulative, but it's quite fascinating. You mentioned choice blindness. That's another story, but I want to mention another experiment which I really think is quite fascinating. That's not in the book, and it's called change blindness. And the experiment goes like this. You approach a random person on the street, say that you have a map, and you walk up to him or her and you say, oh, can you help me find this place? I'm a bit lost, and so on. And you start to discuss with this person. And while you discuss with this person, you discuss for 1 or 2 minutes. When you do that, suddenly there comes two workers who's working on a house nearby, and they carry a big door and they walk just between you and the other person. So for 5 seconds, you don't see each other. And what happened, they are part of this trick. So what happens then when the door is just between you, the guy who's carrying the door in the front is changing place with the guy with the map. So they just swap, and then the door goes on. And about 50% of the random guy on the street doesn't notice that he's talking to a new person. He thinks that he's still talking to the same person. And, so that's called change blindness. You don't notice that the person was swapped, because obviously they are actors, and they do this, like they simulate that it should be the same person. But I mean, he can have other clothes, and he can have other hair color and everything, and you don't notice that. It's called change blindness. Quite fascinating. So I mean, we should not trust our perceptions too much.
Indeed. And I think one thing helps that process is reading about them. Like once you know that story, you probably next time if there's really a person coming in, you might have a light bulb. Oh, I need to, I remember.
Exactly. And that's the whole idea with this chapter. I mean, I think you can sort of practice the skills here. And as you say, just the fact that you know of this makes you a little bit more careful, and a little bit more not dogmatic about what you think that you saw, or that you think that you know, and so on. Right. Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, exactly. I think I want to offer one very simple practical example on pricing, because everybody do, everyday shopping all the time. And usually you're on one side, you look at the things that, okay, this is, 30% off or 50% off. That's when you make a decision, or I want to go 50% off.
Yeah.
But actually, like, if you look at the same thing at a different platform, you probably find, okay, this thing probably half the 50% off to begin with. So, so you kind of break that anchoring effect yourself. So like actually all those things, I want to make that point, is that say it's not only theory or the way we look at cognitive science. It actually helps in our daily decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why this kind of understanding our mind, or how foolish our mind can be, is is a valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Now let's move on. I'll just say one more time. If you find this conversation fascinating, all these examples, because with limited time we have with Crystal, we can only cover a few. But this book itself has a wealth of concept clarification, and also research-based outcomes, like all this mind traps that we talked about. Actually there are lots of them have experiments behind it, and knowing what it is. So like make sure you grab a copy of the book and you'll enjoy reading it just like as I do. And then let's I want to touch a few things on the second part, which is also fascinating. I think one of them, you talk about the history of ideas on chapter 11. And how the secular thought originated. And also I love it how you talk about the global philosophical roots. If you can you give us a bit of an overview how you see the secular thought evolve in the sort of the history of ideas spectrum?
Well, maybe, I mean, from a Western perspective, it originated with the Greek philosophers of nature, you know, Thales and Anaximander. And I know that that China had their own thinkers at that time, but I'm not super familiar with them. So my reference point is obviously the Western philosophers. But I mean, those philosophers about 500 years before our time, before year zero, they were philosophers of nature. I mean, they had the idea that through our rational processes and empirical investigations, we can understand what nature is. And some of them believed in gods, but the Greek gods, but they thought that they are irrelevant for the understanding of nature. So in that sense, they were secular. I mean, and some of them definitely were atheists as well. But I mean, you had both of that. But they thought that the gods is not relevant for understanding nature, and that was sort of in the Western culture, the first secular thought, that you separate the ideas of religion or gods from your understanding of the world. Then obviously, I mean, in Europe, you have to give credit to Christianity for creating the universities and for nurturing the idea that there is a God who made the world in an intelligent, designed way, so that we can develop skills to understand the world. And that obviously is not a proof of God's existence, but it's definitely, it had an influence on the development of early science. So in that sense, the religion helped science to develop. But what happened then is, of course, that the scientific method could separate from the religious traditions and stand on its own feet, so to speak. And then in the Enlightenment, I mean, 300-400 years ago, and the Enlightenment movement started to develop, then of course, there was also a reaction towards the religious institutions' power, the church's power over people, and that people started to reject that power and say, it's not acceptable. We don't have to follow these dogmas or these rules that the church is trying to force us to. So that was like a rebellion attitude towards the church, obviously. So that's also a part of the secular process. But I mean, it took until the 20th century before you know, in Sweden, church and state separated in the year 2000. It's just 25 years ago. Before that, the church was a part of the state. I mean, it's quite crazy if you think about it. France was earlier, because the Enlightenment revolution in France, of course, they separated state and church, I think, in 1905, I think. So it's 100 years earlier than Sweden. But during the 19th century, of course, it has, in the Western tradition, it has been thinkers like Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, or Einstein, for example. Some people try to claim that Einstein was religious, but I disagree. I mean, he had a great admiration for the beauty of nature, and he sometimes used religious metaphors to talk about his fascination of nature, but he was not a religious person. He thought the stories of the Bible was childish. That's in his letters to his friends and so on. And he was quite irritated that people tried to claim that he was religious. But yeah, and if you go back to the 17th century, you had Spinoza, the great philosopher, who tried to develop a completely secular ethics, an ethic system based on secular thought and no religious thought. And that, I know that there has been ancient Chinese thinkers who also did that, and also in the Indian philosophy tradition, you had that way back. So the secular processes have sort of simultaneously developed within the great world civilizations, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that overview. Indeed, it's very interesting. I think it's meaningful. Yes, as you said, of course, it's different. You know, the East has its own sort of track, because I think the world is much more disconnected than it became later. But there's no doubt the current world is much more similar, I would say. Like, and I think the Age of Enlightenment definitely played a big role in the forming of the current world order, or more consensus of what civilization or advancement is. So thank you for that very, 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 succinct, but very interesting and powerful overview. And then you're calling towards the end of this chapter on a sort of a new enlightenment. What do you mean? What do you think need to happen?
Well,
Given that.
yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important to get rid of this relativistic view of truths, because if you have a relativistic view of truths when it comes to scientific knowledge, then it's very easy to have it when it comes to moral ideas as well. And we mentioned it a little bit before, but if you don't accept that universal human rights should be available for everyone on equal terms, then it's very dangerous, because then you tend to accept what the Afghanistan's Taliban's, do to their women, for example, and it's completely unacceptable. So to revitalize the idea of human rights and objective truth, that's a part of the Enlightenment movement, and of course also to reestablish the trust in reason. I mean, the flame of reason, which is the title of my book, that you should not rely on scripture, holy scriptures, or on prophecies, or on revelations. You should rely on reason, basically, and evidence when it comes to how the world works. And as I mentioned, the secular ethics not based on religious dogma or religious scripture. And I mean, the world is unfortunately developing in the wrong direction right now. We see religious fundamentalism growing, both within Islam but also in Christian countries, and in America. And for example, there are big movements in America that wants to ban abortion at any stage in the pregnancy. Some even want to ban in vitro fertilization, IVF treatments for couples, because they have this religious idea that it's a human from the first moment, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, the world is developing in the wrong way here. I mean, we have Hindu nationalism in India, we have Christian fundamentalism in America and in Poland. Actually, Poland has, in the last election, it goes the right way. So that's one of the exceptions. The development in Poland right now is going in the good way, I think. But in many parts of the world, it's going the wrong way. You have in Bangladesh, for example, Islamist radicals are even killing people who are fighting for the secular values there. I have had Bangladeshi refugees living in my little guest house here in Sweden for many years, because they had to flee from their country because it was dangerous. And the secular humanist movement in the world, it exists in many countries. I've met many of the leaders in other countries, and in some countries it's even dangerous to be a secular humanist, because then you're an atheist, and it's blasphemy. They don't accept that. In some countries you get killed for being an atheist. Not in China, which is good. but in Saudi Arabia, I mean, you can get killed for being an atheist, and probably in Iran as well. You can be killed for being a homosexual, for example, in some of these countries, only because they think it's a religious dogma. They believe that God thinks that you should be killed if you're homosexual. They obviously believe that, otherwise they wouldn't treat them that way. So reestablishing, your question was about the Enlightenment values. Reestablish the ideas of universal human rights, the ideas of reason and objective reality, but also the idea of a secular state, which means everyone should be allowed to have their own religious beliefs or not religious beliefs, but only as long as it doesn't affect other people, as long as you don't try to impose your beliefs on other people, then you should have the right to exist in a society as a religious person, of course.
But one of the challenge of that, of course, what you described is all true. But I think, one of the challenge or one of the reason why there's almost a reversal of, Enlightenment is that, those fundamental groups, frankly, has more resources, right? Because there's more people. It's easier to, you can use the word fool. 1 second, I'll just open the door.
Sure.
Yeah, so let me re-say that. So it's my daughter coming home. So like, just like in the past, the church, Catholic Church is probably the most successful financial institution in the world.
Yeah.
It has more resources, has more, and therefore in some cases they can control the machinery of violence, right? So they're controlling the military or whatever other forces. So in a way, sometimes people get depressed looking at this. I think many people listening to this would agree to the values you talked about, and then it's shared by many. But the fact is that, the ones controlling the power, either financial resources or as a result or extension of that, machinery of violence, are more easier in the power of more extreme groups. And then how do we, situate ourselves in this situation?
Yeah, but you're right, of course. I mean, the Catholic Church is a very big church, and the fascinating thing with them is that it harbors so many ideas. I mean, I know very, very liberal Catholics who does not agree with the Vatican's view of homosexuality or abortion and so on. And then, of course, you have these very, very conservative Catholics in Africa, for example. The Catholic Church is very conservative, or Latin America, and not as much in Europe. But anyway, but you're right. It's a very powerful organization with a lot of money. So of course, if it goes to the conservative direction, it affects the whole countries where Catholicism is dominant. I think the main question here is probably, why is there a rise of religious fundamentalism? Why is that coming back so strongly? I mean, Iran was once a very secular country, but now it's going the other direction. I think that is because for many people, globalization is a frightening thing. Globalization means that you have influences from many cultures. You cannot sort of ground yourself in your own tradition, because there's so much people from all over the world in your surroundings and so much influences and so on. And this scares some people. Some people likes it, some people get scared. And if that scares you, you need to go back to some kind of value system that you can clinch to hang into. And then it's quite easy to go back to the religious traditionalist dogmas, because you can always trust them, so to speak. They are not affected by modernity. They are not, and which is the problem from my point of view. But for these people who are scared of modernity and globalization, they become something that you cling on to or hold on to. That's why I think we see a resurrection of fundamentalism. Actually, also the fact that women are empowered in many parts of the world, educated, and super smart and have good jobs and so on. If you don't like that as a patriarchal man, you need some way to say no to that, and then you can refer to the scriptures, the religious traditions that says that the woman should be below the man in hierarchy. So it's I think it's useful tools for those who do not want the globalized modern world.
Indeed, it's an easy retreat.
Yeah,
Almost.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels safe. So at the end of the day, it's also always a false sense of security. By going back to your survival or evolution track, sort of, that's kind of what we are programmed for. So we're programmed for survival, for security, even if it's a false illusion of security, but that's more attractive.
Exactly. And also, it's a very good tool against against the reasonable arguments for development, because you can always say, who are you to question the word of God? The word of God cannot be questioned. It doesn't matter what good reasonable arguments you have for different things, because it's in the scripture. This is the word of God, and therefore you're not allowed to question that. And that, of course, is a very convenient way to hold on to very traditional values.
Yeah, indeed. So I mean, this is an intellectual process. So almost, your instinct to counter that is that you have a Bible equivalent for the secular. But then that per se defeat the purpose of secular. So it's almost
no, but I see what you mean. But the whole thing is that all the ideas that I propose in this book should be critically examined and questioned with good arguments, of course. And then you have the process of intellectual discussion.
Yeah, indeed. I think that leads to my last question. But before I get to that, I want to say one more time, if you enjoy this conversation, find this intellectually inquisitive and eye-opening, get this book yourself, 点燃理性的火焰, so you can find the Chinese version in the link below. Here you go. You can read Chinese too. All right. Okay, so the last question I have is on the role of education. I think that's where you ended your book as well. And then, things we could be aware of or be intentional about in looking at education for our children. So, you have a 14-year-old son now. Then, so like both as a father and as a philosopher, thinker, public intellect, what are your advices for our parents listening to this talk?
Oh dear, yeah. I mean, first of all, to try to get your children to be readers. I mean, that's the first important thing. And in Sweden, as in many other countries, that is actually a problem because children, they have their mobile phones and they play with them all the time, and they don't read as much as they should. But if you can develop a lust or passion for reading, then you're opening so many worlds to the kids. So that's a very important thing. Then
I want to throw you a curveball here, because many people will say, hey, the age of AI is coming. We can just plant a chip in their brain sometime. Why do I
Well, okay, we'll see about that. We cannot plant chips in the brain yet, and I'm not sure that we will be able to do that. Maybe, yeah. I mean, I'm very fascinated by artificial intelligence. I was a computer scientist. That's my academic background, so I studied that quite a lot, actually. I think AI will do tremendous good for us. We can use it in many, many ways, which is going to be really fantastic. But I still think to develop your own cognitive skills and open up the world for your intellect, then you need to read. And I think that also the school system has to be much better, at least in Sweden. I don't know how it's in China, but in Sweden, we don't teach critical thinking very much in schools. I mean, we teach the children to be observant of where they get information from on the internet. I mean, what are the sources and so on. But that's just a little part of critical thinking. I mean, all these things that I mentioned in chapter 4 in my book is our cognitive weaknesses and how we can learn to navigate through that. That should be taught in school as well. Because if you realize that your intuitions is not always right, then you get more then you get more critical thinking in your thinking tools, so to speak. And that's extremely important these days when there are so many conspiracy theories and weird ideas floating around on the internet. You can see a complete and very professional made documentary on YouTube claiming that the Earth is flat, for example, and it looks like a very well made documentary, or documentaries saying that the moon landing was a fake, for example. I know people who think that. I mean, grown-ups who think that the moon landing was a fake. They haven't understood what critical thinking is. So this is very important for our education system, I think, to teach critical thinking in the broadest sense. And then I'm also arguing in my book, I think, that we should not allow for religious schools, because that's a phenomena that there is in Europe. You can put your child in a school run by the church. And I think as long as you have a school system like we have in Sweden, where every child must go to school, then it should not be indoctrinated with a religious thought system in school. They can do that on their free time, because of course, if the parents are religious, they must be allowed to introduce the religion to the kids, but not through the school system.
But wouldn't people argue that that's a restraint of their freedom?
Yeah, I know, but the child also have freedom of religion. The child has the right to not be indoctrinated in a school system where they have to go to that school, where they have to go to school, I mean. So in a way, I'm defending the children's right to freedom of religion, religious freedom, rather than the parents' right. The parents can do whatever they want in the free time.
Yeah, I love that perspective. It's the children respecting them. Since sometimes it's very interesting. On the one hand, this fundamentalists, they think even one cell is alive. On the other hand, they don't really respect them as a life of their own.
Exactly. And exactly. And in America, that you're absolutely right. The human right must be a gradual process when the cell is becoming more and more cells, and that's of course a difficult decision to where the limit should be, but it's definitely not when it's just one cell.
Yeah, exactly. And then if I may ask a maybe a seemingly private question, like if
Sure.
you are a father, what are the things you often say with your son? Like what kind of conversation do you conduct at home on this process, critical thinking?
No, but I think I remember when he was very, very small, he went to the first year in school, and he came home one day and said, Daddy, my friends in school, in the class, believe in ghosts. It's so embarrassing, he said. So somehow I had influenced him without really knowing it quite early. But what I'm trying to teach him is to look at the world with fascination and awe. One thing I did when he was very young as well, I live in a house and you can walk up on a little mountain on the backside of my house in the winter when there is a clear sky with stars. And I said to him, come, let's go up on the mountain here, and we'll lay our backs, we lay down on the ground. It was cold winter, and we looked at the stars. And I said to him, imagine now that you are looking down instead of up, because there is no up and down in the universe. It's not a defined concept. So it's just as correct to think that you're looking down when you lay on the ground and look on the stars. I remember that he was extremely affected by that, because you get almost a fainting feeling, because if you think that you're looking down, it's very weird, but it also opens up your mind for the beauty of the universe. So, well, and another thing, I'll just say one more thing. I decided very early when he was very small that we should have a microscope and a telescope in the house. I mean, not very expensive things, but a simple microscope and a simple telescope. And just because I wanted him to learn about the micro world and the macro world at the same time as the sort of normal world that we have around us. So, you know, very early we looked at blood, for example, in the microscope, and we looked at insects and the wings of a fly and things like that. And in the telescope, we looked at Jupiter, and you can see the 4 moons of Jupiter. And the moon, obviously, it's beautiful to see all the craters and so on. So I wanted to let him experience the whole world. It's not only the world that we can see with our eyes. And yeah, I hope that inspired him. He wants to study science when he goes to the gymnasium next year, and yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, wonderful. I love it. I love it. This. So basically, you're doing 2 things. One is changing perspectives.
Yeah,
When you look up to look down, right? So because up and down is only makes sense in certain parameters.
exactly.
Before, you could be on the bottom of the earth, right? Well, or maybe even the whole concept of up and down doesn't make any sense anyway when you're at a different perspective. So you're asking him to change perspective, and second, you're helping him to enlarge perspectives, right? So enlarge both in terms of the macro side,
Yeah,
and also the micro. And those are golden advices, and hope that parents can take from that too. And then and you know, maybe we should also put a link to a telescope and a microscope next to the book.
yeah, good point. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, look, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasant experience talking to you, listening to your thoughts, and of course, and I also thank you for putting this work, because this work you've been working on it for multiple years, and again, as I said in the beginning, it took multiple very heavyweight intellects for this book to be available in Chinese, from you to Douglas Hofstad, and then to Mei Jianhua, which is the Chinese translator of your book. So it's really a gem, and you can take it home with a very low price. Yeah, anyway, it's very cheap in China. This is how the Chinese market works. It's not your book. But compared to the books in the US or Europe, the market, the price here is much lower. So
that's good.
Yeah, it's a good
Then
investment.
more people can afford it.
Yes, absolutely. So usually books, even like full price, like this one, the full price listed price is 78 RMB, which is about $10 US dollars. But usually people can get it at 80% or 70% they buy online. And that's the standard of market pricing in China. So it's very accessible. So it's a good investment of your money for the wisdom tools that this book provides for us to live in a reason-supported life that's based on ration, and also help us access wisdom at the same time. Thank you so much again. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you, and I really enjoyed it, I must say.
Thank you. Yeah, this book and your work are fascinating. All right. Okay. So again, make sure you get a copy of the book from the link below. 大家可以在这里直播间看到这本书。And I hope you enjoy reading once you have it at home. Thank you again, Crystal, for first of all doing all this work and for having this conversation with us.
Thank you so much.